The desert had a way of swallowing sound, of making a man believe he was the last soul alive on earth. Caleb Ward had lived with that silence for 20 years. He knew every crack in the parched ground outside his cabin, every whisper of the wind as it rattled through the mesquite trees. It was his only company now, the wind, the creak of a weathered saddle, and the distant cry of a hawk riding the thermals above the Arizona desert. Caleb was a man shaped by dust and regret. At 53, his hair had gone gray at the temples, and his face was a map of scars and sunburns. Each line seemed to hold a memory he would rather forget. He rose with the sun, tended to his 2 remaining horses, and checked the water troughs, as though it mattered. It was a kind of ritual, a penance for sins no one else remembered but him. He had once been a feared gunslinger. People spoke his name with either admiration or fear. But Caleb didn't feel like a man worth fearing anymore. Years ago, when he'd ridden with a company of soldiers and bounty men, they had burned down an Apache village for gold and revenge. It had been chaos, smoke rising like black wings, gunfire shredding the air, women and children screaming. Caleb had pulled the trigger that day. He had killed for coin, not cause, and the weight of that truth had driven him into the wastelands to die slowly, one day at a time. His cabin stood alone on the edge of a salt-flat plain, little more than a weathered wooden box patched with tin. A split-rail fence kept the horses from wandering too far, though, truth be told, they had nowhere else to go. Like their owner, they were too stubborn to give up, even as the desert tried its best to grind them into dust. Inside, the cabin smelled of old leather and ashes. A single Bible lay on the table, its pages cracked from heat. Caleb hadn't opened it in years, but sometimes, at night, he found his hand resting on it like a man reaching for a lifeline he didn't deserve. He had stopped counting the days. Life wasn't measured by calendars anymore, but by the wear on his boots and the fading of scars. He'd convinced himself he was fine with it, just another ghost wandering the frontier, forgotten by God and man alike. But that morning, as the sun climbed high and the heat shimmered off the horizon, something stirred in the distance. Caleb was fixing a loose board on the corral when he saw it, a dark shape against the pale sand, swaying like a mirage. At first, he thought it was a coyote circling a carcass. Then, as he narrowed his eyes, he realized it was a person. His hand instinctively went to the revolver at his hip, though it had been months since he'd drawn it. He didn't trust strangers. Out here, strangers often meant trouble. Men with bad intentions, or worse, soldiers, still nursing grudges from old wars. He debated ignoring it, pretending he hadn't seen anything, but something about the figure gnawed at him. There was no horse nearby, no camp, no shade. A man, or a woman, alone in the desert like that wouldn't last long. Caleb spat the dust from his mouth, grabbed his canteen, and started walking. The closer he got, the more his gut tightened. It wasn't a man at all. It was a girl, young, maybe 20 at most, bound to a wooden post like an animal left to die. Her hair, black as raven feathers, was matted with sand and blood. Her lips were cracked, her face streaked with sweat. The turquoise pendant at her neck caught the sun, glinting like a warning. Caleb stopped a few feet away. He could see now that she was Apache, one of the very people he had once helped destroy. Her half-open eyes fixed on him with something between defiance and desperation. She was barely breathing. For a long moment, Caleb stood frozen. His instincts screamed at him to walk away. Helping her meant crossing a line, inviting every kind of trouble he'd spent 2 decades avoiding. But then he saw her eyes. Dark, fierce, unyielding. They were the same eyes his daughter had once looked at him with before she left, before he became the man who lived only with ghosts. Caleb exhaled sharply, cursed under his breath, and reached for the knife at his belt. The rope was thick, rawhide cut deep into her wrists, and Caleb's hands trembled slightly as he saw the marks. With a swift motion, he sliced through the bindings. The girl collapsed forward, and he caught her before she hit the ground. Her weight was nothing, just bone and heat, like a bird that had fallen from the sky. "Easy now," he muttered, though he wasn't sure if she could understand him. Her head rolled against his chest, and he caught the faint sound of her breath, a shallow rasp that said she hadn't had water in far too long. Caleb pulled the canteen from his belt, tilting it toward her lips. She drank like someone who had almost forgotten how, each gulp desperate but weak. "Who did this to you?" he asked, even though he knew she wouldn't answer. She just blinked, her eyes clouded with exhaustion but still holding a spark of stubborn life. Caleb looked over his shoulder, scanning the horizon. Nothing moved, but the desert was deceptive. Danger could be hiding just beyond the nearest ridge. He'd learned that the hard way. Whoever had left her here might still be close, watching, waiting to finish the job. "Damn fools," he muttered, crouching down to scoop her up. She weighed less than a sack of grain. "Come on, girl, you're not dying out here." Back at the cabin, Caleb kicked open the door and carried her inside, laying her on his own bed. The old springs creaked under her light frame. He filled a basin with cool water, soaking a cloth and pressing it gently to her forehead. Her skin burned under his touch. Fever had already taken hold. As he worked, memories slipped in like unwelcome guests. The night of fire and blood, when the world turned red in an Apache camp. He could still see the flames licking the sky, the cries of children, the weight of his own gun in his hand. A face flashed in his mind, a man's face, painted for war, eyes fierce and unbroken. Caleb had shot that man. He remembered that too well. Looking at this girl now, he wondered if she was kin to him. Maybe his daughter. Maybe his sister. Maybe she was the last thread tying the past to the present, and fate had dragged her to his door to test what little soul he had left. When he unfastened the turquoise pendant around her neck to clean the blood at her collar, his breath caught. The stone was cracked, but still vibrant, carved into the shape of a small crescent moon. It was nearly identical to the pendant he had once given his daughter when she was 10. She had worn it the last time he saw her, the day she turned her back on him after learning what he had done. The girl stirred, her lips moved. "What's your name?" Caleb asked quietly. "Yana," she whispered, the word breaking like dry twigs. "All right, Ayana, rest. You're safe now." The word tasted foreign on his tongue. When was the last time anyone had been safe out here? He sat back on the edge of the bed, his revolver still within reach on the table. Outside, the wind shifted, carrying with it the faint thud of distant hoofbeats. Caleb's heart tightened. Riders. Whoever had done this to Ayana wasn't far. He considered his choices. He could take her to town and leave her there, let someone else deal with her troubles. He could patch her up and send her on her way. Or he could walk away now, close the door, pretend none of this had ever happened. But he knew the truth. He was already involved. Caleb poured the last of his water into a cup and placed it near her hand. She was unconscious again, but he could see her chest rising, shallow but steady. As he looked at her, the silence of the cabin felt different, heavier. "Maybe this is what I get," he murmured, "for trying to hide from everything I've done." His gaze drifted to the turquoise pendant, now resting on the table like a shard of the past. He didn't know why, but something about that stone, about this girl, told him his life would never be the same. Caleb didn't know it yet, but the moment he cut that rope, the ghosts of his past had begun to stir. Trouble was coming. If you found this helpful, a quick like really helps us keep creating. The first drops of dusk had begun to cool the desert when Caleb Ward stepped out of his cabin, a strip of leather in one hand, a tin of herbs in the other. The girl was still unconscious, her breathing shallow and uneven. He had placed her on a worn cot against the wall, near where the last light of the setting sun filtered through the warped window pane. Caleb squatted beside her and studied her face. There was something both fierce and fragile about her, like a hawk grounded by a broken wing. Her skin was burned raw from the desert heat. Her wrists blistered where the rawhide had cut in deep. She needed tending, and fast. He opened the tin, revealing a handful of dried herbs and roots his late wife had gathered years ago. Wild sage and desert aloe, the kind of medicine she'd believed in more than any doctor. Caleb had kept them, though he'd never told anyone why. Perhaps some part of him hoped he'd need them one day, that maybe a scrap of her care could still save someone. "All right," he muttered, soaking the herbs in warm water from the kettle on the stove. "Let's see what we can do." With practiced hands, he cleaned the wounds on her wrists, wrapping them gently in strips of torn linen. She flinched once, even in sleep, her breath catching as if she were fighting him in some half-remembered nightmare. Caleb paused, his jaw tightening. He wasn't good with people anymore, not since his wife left, not since the massacre that had stained his soul. But he forced his hands steady, whispering softly as he worked, as though his words might anchor her. "You're safe for now. No one's gonna hurt you here." When he touched the cut at her temple, his thumb brushed against something cold. The turquoise pendant. It gleamed in the lamplight, an unyielding flash of color against all the dust and blood. For a heartbeat, Caleb froze. He knew this stone. He'd seen it before, on his daughter's neck, back when she still smiled at him. The memory tore through him like a bullet. He had to look away before it swallowed him whole. A faint vibration rippled through the floorboards. Caleb's head snapped up. He stepped to the door, listening. Hoofbeats. "Damn," he hissed. He blew out the lantern and crouched by the window, peering out at the desert horizon. A thin veil of dust curled into the darkening sky, maybe half a mile away. Riders. Too many to be travelers. He recognized that pattern, the deliberate spread of men on horseback searching the ground. Caleb's mind sharpened. He'd spent years avoiding conflict, but old instincts didn't die. Not when trouble was riding straight for you. He glanced back at the girl. Ayanna, she had whispered her name earlier. If those riders were looking for her, and something in his gut told him they were, then keeping her here meant he was stepping into a fight he hadn't asked for. For a moment, he almost considered it. He could drag her to the edge of the property, leave her with a water skin, and disappear. No one would know. No one would blame him. But then her hand shifted on the cot, fingers curling weakly like a child's reaching for help. Caleb stared at that small, desperate gesture, and the decision was made. He was already in too deep. He grabbed his rifle from above the hearth, checked the chamber, and set it against the wall near the door. Then he poured water into a tin cup and placed it beside her hand. "Drink when you wake," he murmured, not sure if she could hear. "We're gonna need you strong." The hoofbeats grew louder now, pounding like distant thunder. Caleb stepped out onto the porch, his eyes narrowing at the figures forming on the horizon. The past he'd been running from was finally coming for him. The riders crested the ridge just as the sun slipped below the horizon, painting the desert in strokes of fire and blood. Caleb stayed on the porch, leaning one shoulder against the weathered doorframe. His rifle rested casually in his hands, but his stance was anything but relaxed. He counted 6 men, all mounted on lean, dust-streaked horses. They rode in a V formation, like a pack of wolves. The leader broke away first, urging his horse forward with a snap of the reins. He was broad-shouldered, his black coat flaring like crow wings in the evening wind. Even from a distance, Caleb recognized him. Clayton Briggs. The name alone carried a stench of gunpowder and greed. A gunslinger turned hired muscle for the mining barons. Briggs was known for breaking men as easily as he broke horses.
"Evening, Ward," Briggs called, his voice cutting through the dry air like a knife. "Didn't think I'd find you rotting out here." Caleb said nothing. He let the silence stretch until it was almost insulting. Briggs grinned, revealing teeth stained from too much tobacco. "Still the same, huh? A man of few words. You always were a stubborn cuss." His gaze swept over the cabin, lingering just long enough to make Caleb's skin prickle. "You seen anyone come through here today? A girl, maybe? Apache? Pretty thing with dark eyes." Caleb's fingers tightened on the stock of his rifle, though his voice stayed even. "Haven't seen a soul in weeks. Desert's empty this time of year." Briggs tilted his head, studying Caleb with the sharpness of a predator scenting blood. "Funny thing, though, we tracked her trail right past your fence line." He nodded to one of his men, a wiry rider with a crooked grin. "Ain't that right, Slim?" Slim spat into the dust. "Tracks don't lie." Caleb felt the weight of their suspicion, but he didn't flinch. He'd lied to worse men than Briggs before. "Maybe you lost the trail," he said flatly. "Desert's tricky like that. Each tracks and spits 'em where they don't belong." Briggs dismounted, the spurs on his boots jingling softly as he walked up the steps of the porch. He stopped just short of Caleb, his grin widening. "You always were a clever bastard. But I know you, Ward. You've got that hero streak, buried deep under all that rust. If you found her, you'd try to play savior." Caleb met his gaze, his eyes cold and unblinking. "Ain't my business who lives or dies out here. Not anymore." For a moment, neither man moved. The air between them hummed with unspoken challenge. Then Briggs laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "Maybe you're telling the truth. Maybe not. But if you do see her, you tell her Briggs is coming, and she won't get far." Briggs turned and mounted his horse in one smooth motion. His men followed, their silhouettes melting back into the darkening horizon. But Caleb knew better than to believe they were gone for good. Men like Briggs circled like vultures, waiting for a sign of weakness. When the sound of hooves finally faded, Caleb let out a long breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. He stepped back into the cabin, shutting the door behind him. Ayanna's eyes were open now. She had woken while he was talking to Briggs, and her gaze was sharp, burning with both fear and fury. "Who are they?" she asked, her voice hoarse but steady. "Trouble," Caleb answered simply. He sat on the edge of the bed, his jaw tightening. The kind that don't let go until they get what they want. She stared at him for a long moment, and he could see the mistrust there. It was the same look he'd seen in the faces of Apache warriors decades ago, men who'd watched their families die. And for the first time in years, Caleb felt ashamed all over again. Caleb tossed a few sticks into the stove, coaxing a low fire to life. The cabin glowed with a warm, flickering light, but the air between him and Ayanna was cold as steel. She sat upright on the cot now, the linen bandages stark against her bronze skin. Her eyes, dark, unwavering, followed his every move. "You should rest," Caleb muttered, crouching by the fire. "You're still weak." "I don't trust you." The words landed like an arrow, sharp and certain. Caleb straightened, meeting her gaze. "Didn't ask you to." She tilted her head, studying him with a quiet intensity that felt like judgment. "Your name," she said, her voice low but steady, "is Caleb Ward." He froze. He hadn't told her his name. Her lips curled into something that wasn't quite a smile. "I've heard stories of you, the white ghost with cold eyes. My father told them around the fire when I was a child, long before he—" Her voice faltered, but her glare hardened again. "Before men like you came with fire and bullets." Caleb's breath caught. There was no need to ask who her father was. He remembered the man, tall, proud, with feathers in his hair and defiance burning in his eyes. A man who had stood his ground against impossible odds. Caleb had seen him fall. He had been part of the storm that brought him down. "You were there," Ayanna said, her voice trembling now. "The night they came. Soldiers, mercenaries, you burned our homes. You killed him. You killed my father." Caleb lowered his head. His hands, rough and scarred, curled into fists. "I was there," he admitted quietly. "But I wasn't the one who—" He stopped. What was the point of excuses? A bullet doesn't care who fired it. "I was following orders, and I've been running from that night ever since." Ayanna's silence was worse than anger. She looked at him as if trying to decide whether to spit on him or slit his throat. "You expect me to believe you're different now?" she asked. "No," Caleb said. "I don't expect anything from you. Truth is, I'm not sure I deserve to breathe the same air as you. But those men outside, Briggs and his pack, they're worse than I ever was. They'll tear through this land until there's nothing left." Ayanna's gaze flickered toward the door, her jaw tightening. "They're hunting me because I carry something they want, and they'll kill anyone who stands in their way." Caleb's brow furrowed. What is it they're after? She hesitated, her hand brushing against the turquoise pendant. "Something that belongs to my people. Something I will not let them have." Her eyes softened for just a moment, then sharpened again. "Why did you save me, Ward? Was it guilt? Or do you think saving one Apache girl will wash the blood from your hands?" Caleb swallowed hard. "Maybe it's both. Maybe it's just that I couldn't leave another soul to die alone in the dust." Her expression shifted slightly, though the mistrust remained. "You shouldn't have gotten involved," she whispered. "Now they'll come for you too." Outside, a coyote howled, its cry echoing through the dark. Caleb moved to the window, staring out at the barren land. "Let 'em come," he said quietly. "I've got enough ghosts on my conscience. A few more won't matter." When he turned back, Ayanna was watching him with something new in her eyes. Not forgiveness, not yet, but maybe the faintest glimmer of curiosity. The night deepened, thick and silent, except for the occasional crackle of the stove fire. Ayanna sat cross-legged on the cot, her posture rigid despite the exhaustion etched into her face. Caleb, sitting across the room at the small table, sharpened a hunting knife with slow, deliberate strokes. The rhythmic scrape of metal on stone filled the cabin. "Those men," Caleb said, breaking the silence. "Briggs isn't the kind to chase someone just for revenge. What are they really after?" Ayanna's hand tightened around the turquoise pendant at her throat. For a long moment she said nothing, as if weighing how much she could trust the man who had once been her enemy. Finally, her voice broke the stillness. "They're after a map," she said. "A map that leads to a place they should never touch." Caleb paused mid-stroke, his gaze narrowing. "A place? You mean gold?" Ayanna shook her head. "Not gold. Not the kind of treasure your people think of. There is a canyon hidden in the mountains where turquoise grows like veins through the rock. It's sacred. It is the last safe place for my people, the last piece of land that hasn't been taken, burned, or sold." Caleb leaned back in his chair, frowning. "And you have the map?" Her eyes flashed with defiance. "I was carrying it to my uncle, the elder of our band. Briggs ambushed me before I could reach him. If he gets the canyon, it's not just land he'll destroy. It's our memory, our history, our prayers." The words settled heavy between them, like the weight of the desert night. Caleb felt a familiar ache in his chest, the same hollow pain that came every time he thought about all the things he couldn't undo. The raids, the blood, the children's cries that still haunted his dreams. "Briggs works for mining barons," Caleb said, his tone grim. "If they find that canyon, they'll rip it apart and grind it down to nothing. They won't stop until there's not a single rock left standing." Ayana's gaze sharpened. "Then you understand why I can't let them find it, even if it costs me my life." Caleb stared at her for a long moment, then looked away. He'd spent years avoiding fights that weren't his, years hiding from the man he used to be. But now, with this girl in front of him, he felt the old stirrings of responsibility clawing at his gut. "You should go," he muttered. "Take the map, slip out under the cover of night, and keep moving. If you stay here, Briggs will burn this place to the ground." Ayana gave him a sharp, almost bitter smile. "You think I can outrun them in this condition? Alone? You think I trust you enough to show you where the canyon is?" Caleb didn't answer. He didn't blame her for the distrust. He barely trusted himself. Outside, the wind picked up, whistling through the cracks in the cabin walls. Caleb rose, setting the knife aside. "You don't have to trust me," he said, "but I've got no love for men like Briggs.
"If they're coming here, I'll make damn sure they regret it." Ayana studied him, her eyes lingering on the weariness in his face, the scar across his jaw, the quiet determination that had nothing to do with gold or glory. "Why?" she asked finally. "Why would you risk your life for someone like me?" Caleb hesitated. "Because maybe it's time I stood for something other than my own damn shadow." In the distance, faintly, there was a rumble of hoofbeats again, closer this time. Caleb reached for his rifle. "They won't stop," Ayana said softly, "not until they have what they want." "Then we'll give them something else," Caleb replied, "a fight they'll remember." The desert night was a black ocean, moonless and heavy with silence. Caleb sat at the table, cleaning his revolver in the faint glow of the oil lamp. Ayana rested on the cot, her body tense, eyes flickering toward the door with every creak of the old wooden walls. She had sensed it too. The quiet wasn't right. It was the kind of silence that comes before violence. Caleb snapped the cylinder back into place and loaded 6 bullets with methodical precision. He didn't speak, and neither did she. Words weren't needed when danger was that close. Then it came, the distant crunch of hooves on gravel. Caleb's head jerked up, his jaw tightening. The faint glow of torchlight danced on the horizon. "Briggs," Caleb said, his voice low and grim. Ayana pushed herself upright, wincing as the movement pulled at her bandages. "How many?" "Too many," Caleb muttered. He blew out the lamp, and the cabin plunged into darkness. Only the thin silver outline of the window remained, glowing faintly under the starlight. The first shot shattered the silence, a bullet slamming into the wooden shutter. Splinters rained across the floor. Caleb dropped to one knee, rifle ready, eyes scanning the window. "Stay low," he whispered to Ayana. She was already on the floor, clutching the turquoise pendant like a prayer. "Ward!" Briggs' voice thundered from the darkness outside. "Hand over the girl and we'll leave you with your life. Stand in my way and this little shack will burn with you in it." Caleb's reply was a single rifle shot. The bullet tore through the night, striking the dirt just inches from Briggs' boot. The silence that followed was sharp,
dangerous. "Suit yourself," Briggs roared.
"Light it up, boys!" Flames erupted along the side of the cabin as a torch sailed through the window, rolling across the floor. Ayanna scrambled to smother it with a blanket, while Caleb fired 2 quick shots through the open window, forcing Briggs's men to scatter. "Back door," Caleb hissed, grabbing Ayanna by the arm. She nodded, fear flashing in her eyes, but no hesitation. She followed him to the rear of the cabin, moving as quietly as the creaking boards allowed. The back door opened onto a small corral. Caleb's 2 horses were restless, stamping the ground nervously as the smell of smoke thickened. He grabbed a saddlebag, slinging it over his shoulder, and tossed Ayanna a canteen. "Can you ride?" he asked. She looked at him with defiance. "I can ride better than you can shoot." A corner of Caleb's mouth almost twitched into a smile, but there was no time for that. He swung into the saddle as Ayanna climbed onto the second horse, her movements clumsy but determined despite her injuries. They burst out of the corral just as another torch hit the side of the cabin. Flames licked upward, illuminating Briggs's men as they tried to close in.
"There!" one of them shouted, raising his rifle. Caleb fired first. The man toppled from his horse, hitting the ground with a heavy thud. Ayanna ducked as bullets whistled past, her hands gripping the reins like iron. "Ride hard!" Caleb barked. "Stay close!" The 2 horses thundered across the dark plain, hoofs pounding like war drums. Behind them, the cabin, Caleb's home of 20 years, was swallowed by fire. Smoke rose into the night, black against the stars, and for a moment Caleb felt the old rage burn in his veins. They rode for miles without speaking, only slowing when the flickering firelight was long gone. At last, Caleb pulled his horse to a halt near a cluster of boulders. He dismounted, chest heaving, and looked back at the faint glow on the horizon. "That's the last time I run," he muttered, more to himself than to Ayanna. "They took my home. I won't let them take the rest." The desert night was vast and cold, a black canvas pricked with distant stars. Caleb dismounted near a narrow canyon where boulders jutted like ancient sentinels. He tied the horses to a scrubby mesquite tree, their breath steaming in the chill. Ayanna slid down from her saddle with visible effort, her face pale but her eyes bright, reflecting both exhaustion and fire. Caleb gathered dry brush and struck a match, coaxing a small fire into life. The flames crackled, sending shadows dancing across their faces. For a while, neither spoke. The silence felt heavier now, laced with all that had been lost. "They'll track us by morning," Ayanna said quietly, hugging her knees to her chest. "Briggs won't stop until he has the map. He'll burn the desert itself if he must." Caleb stared into the fire, his jaw tight. "Then we don't let him have it." She studied him, her gaze sharp. "Why? Why would you risk your life for a girl whose people have every reason to hate you?" Caleb didn't answer right away. He picked up a small stick, poking at the embers. "Because I hate the man I used to be," he said finally. "I rode with men like Briggs once. We were promised gold, land, glory. All we left behind were ashes." His voice roughened. "Your father was one of the last men I saw that night. He stood his ground, even when the fire came. I remember the look in his eyes. Not fear, just defiance." Ayanna's lips tightened, but she did not interrupt. "I thought leaving the world behind would make the ghosts quiet," Caleb continued, "but they never do. Every night I see the flames, I hear the screams. And tonight, when I saw you tied out there, it felt like I was right back in that moment, except this time I had a chance to do something different." The firelight flickered across Ayanna's face. She was silent for a long while, then said, "Do you think saving me will erase what you did?" Caleb's eyes met hers, full of weary honesty. "No, some sins can't be erased.
But maybe I can balance the scales a little before I leave this world." Ayana looked away, her fingers brushing the turquoise pendant. For the first time, her voice softened. "My father would have said every man has a chance to change, but he would also have made you prove it." Caleb gave a small, humorless smile. "Then I guess I'll have to prove it." The night deepened, the wind carrying distant echoes. Maybe wolves, maybe men. Caleb stood and checked his rifle, running a calloused hand over the barrel. "We can't just keep running. Briggs will catch us sooner or later."
"But if we pick where we fight," he glanced at the canyon walls around them, "we might have a chance." "You want to fight them?" Ayana's tone was incredulous, but not without admiration. "I'm tired of hiding," Caleb said. "They burned my home. I'm done letting men like Briggs take whatever they want." He sat down again, his voice quieter now. "I don't know how much longer I'll live, Ayana. I'm not a young man anymore. But if I die protecting you, maybe I'll finally have the right to face my maker." Ayana studied him for a long time, her expression unreadable. Then she gave a small nod. "Then I will fight too. Not because I trust you, but because I have no choice." Caleb chuckled softly. "Fair enough." As the fire crackled between them, the desert seemed to hold its breath. Caleb felt something shift inside him, a resolve fierce and unyielding. For the first time in 20 years, he wasn't running from his past. He was facing it head on. If you're still watching right now, drop a 1 in the comments so I know you're still with me on this journey. The canyon lay ahead, a jagged scar carved deep into the desert, its walls high and unforgiving. Caleb reined in his horse at the entrance, studying the terrain with a practiced eye. It was the kind of place where a man could vanish or make a stand. "This is where we stop running," he said, his voice rough but resolute. Ayana dismounted, her movements steady despite the bruises still visible on her arms. She glanced at the canyon walls, her eyes narrowing in calculation. "If we know the land better than they do, we can turn their strength against them. We can trap them." Caleb raised a brow. "Trap 6 or 7 armed men with just the 2 of us?" She stepped closer to the canyon wall, tracing her fingers over the rock. "Apache know these canyons. My father taught me how the wind speaks here, how the stones hold secrets. We'll make them fear every shadow." They worked side by side as the sun dipped low, shadows stretching long and thin across the canyon floor. Ayana showed Caleb how to tie thin cords between rock outcroppings, setting crude alarms of hanging stones that would rattle if disturbed. She taught him how to use dry branches and brittle cactus thorns to create false trails, leading anyone following straight into dead ends. "You're fast at this," Caleb muttered, driving a stake into the ground to anchor a snare. "You learn when you must," she replied. Her tone softened for the first time since they met. "I didn't think you would stay. Most men would have left me behind." Caleb paused, his weathered face illuminated by the setting sun. "I've done enough leaving in my life." He tightened the last knot, his fingers working with a precision he hadn't felt in years. "I'm tired of it." When the last trap was set, they sat on a flat rock, sharing a meager meal of jerky and water. The silence between them felt different now, less guarded, almost companionable. "You fight like someone with nothing to lose," Ayana said quietly. Caleb looked at her, the corners of his mouth curving into a tired smile. "Because that's the truth. But if I can help you save your people's land, maybe that means I've got something worth fighting for again." Above them, the desert sky burned orange and crimson, as if the world itself were holding its breath. Tomorrow, the hunters would come. But for the first time, Caleb and Ayana would not be the hunted. The first light of dawn crawled across the canyon, turning the rocks to gold and fire. Caleb crouched behind a jagged outcrop, his rifle resting on his knee. Ayanna was a few yards away, hidden beneath a ledge, her dark hair blending with the shadowed stone. The traps were set, the lines drawn. Now they waited. The silence broke with the echo of hoofbeats. Briggs had come. His men spilled into the canyon like a tide of locusts, rifles slung across their backs, eyes scanning for movement. There were more of them than Caleb had counted before, at least 10 riders. Briggs led the charge, his black coat flaring like the wings of a vulture. "Ward!" Briggs' voice roared, reverberating against the canyon walls. "You got one chance to hand over the girl and whatever she's carrying. Step out, and maybe I'll let you keep breathing." Caleb didn't move. He adjusted his rifle, waiting for the right moment. Ayanna's hand touched the turquoise pendant at her neck, her lips murmuring a quiet prayer in her language. The first trap sprung with a clatter of stones. A rider's horse reared in panic as a tripwire snapped, sending a cascade of rocks crashing down from above. Chaos erupted. Caleb fired once, clean and sharp, dropping a man from his saddle. Another shot whistled past his ear, forcing him back behind cover. "Find them," Briggs bellowed. "Smoke them out." Bullets ricocheted off the rocks, showering Caleb with dust. He glanced at Ayanna. She was calm, steady, signaling him with a hand gesture to flank left. He trusted her. It was a strange feeling, trusting someone again. Moving low, Caleb scrambled along the canyon wall, his boots scraping the sandstone. He ducked behind a boulder and reloaded, his fingers moving with the ease of long-forgotten muscle memory. When he popped up, he took out another rider who was trying to cut them off. "Ward, you can't hide forever!" Briggs' voice was closer now, tinged with anger. He was pushing forward on foot, a revolver gleaming in each hand. Caleb's pulse pounded in his ears. "I'm not hiding," he muttered. "I'm waiting." Then came the signal, Ayanna's whistle, sharp and high. Caleb turned, just as another wave of Briggs' men advanced, and he fired again, his shot knocking one into the snare Ayanna had set. The man screamed as his leg twisted, and the others hesitated. This was no longer a hunt. It was a war. The canyon was alive with chaos, gunfire cracking, dust rising in thick clouds, horses screaming as they bolted. Caleb ducked behind a boulder, a bullet slamming into the rock inches from his head. He gritted his teeth, peering through the haze for Briggs' men. Then he saw it, the glint of a rifle scope high on the ridge. A sniper. Caleb's breath caught as he realized the shooter had the perfect angle on him. He tried to pivot, but the shot rang out before he could move. Ayanna's shout split the air. "Down!" Caleb threw himself to the ground just as the bullet tore a groove through the rock where his skull had been. He glanced up to see Ayanna climbing the ridge with impossible speed, darting between boulders like a shadow. "Ayanna, no!" he barked, but she didn't slow. The sniper chambered another round, eyes locked on Caleb. Before he could fire, a burst of movement distracted him, a decoy. Ayanna had tossed her blanket from the ridge, making it flutter like a fleeing target. The sniper swung his rifle toward it, just as Ayanna lunged from behind, slamming a rock against his hand. The rifle clattered down the slope. Caleb seized the opening, firing a quick shot that took down a second man aiming at her. Ayanna grabbed the fallen rifle, swinging it around with a grace that spoke of years of survival training. From her position on the ridge, she fired a clean shot that scattered Briggs' men below, forcing them to take cover. When the dust cleared for a moment, Caleb saw her silhouette against the sun, strong, defiant, and unafraid. He felt a strange swell of pride. She wasn't just someone to protect, she was fighting beside him as an equal. She slid down the slope, landing beside him with the sniper's rifle slung over her shoulder. Her face was flushed, but her eyes were blazing. "You're too slow," she said with a quick, breathless grin. Caleb couldn't help a short laugh, though the tension was still high. "Remind me never to argue with you again." Gunfire resumed, echoing between the canyon walls. Briggs' men regrouped, shouting orders. Caleb reloaded, glancing sideways at Ayanna. "You saved my hide," he said. "Not yet," she replied, steadying the rifle. "We're still alive."
"That's enough for now." The firefight had slowed, the canyon echoing with the groans of wounded men and the distant rattle of shifting stones. Caleb crouched low behind a slab of rock, his breath ragged. Ayanna was a few paces away, eyes scanning for movement. "Two left," she whispered, "Briggs and one more." Caleb nodded. He could feel Briggs' presence like a storm building on the horizon. The man wasn't the type to retreat quietly. Sure enough, a harsh laugh rang out, cutting through the stillness. "Ward," Briggs' voice carried, raw and mocking. "I should have figured you'd hide behind a girl. That's all you were good for back in the old days, hiding behind someone else's blood." Caleb's jaw tightened. He rose slowly, rifle in hand, and stepped into the open. "I'm done hiding," he called back. Briggs emerged from behind a boulder, his black coat streaked with dust and sweat. He had a revolver in each hand and a smile that promised nothing but pain. "You think you can stop me, old man? I've killed better men than you before breakfast." Caleb leveled his rifle. "Then you'll remember me at supper." The two fired almost in unison. Caleb's shot tore through Briggs's coat, grazing his arm. Briggs' bullet found its mark, slamming into Caleb's side just below the ribs. The pain hit like fire, stealing his breath. Caleb staggered but stayed on his feet, his rifle clattering to the ground. Briggs advanced, his grin widening. "You're done, Ward. Should have stayed out of my way." Caleb's hand went to his hip, drawing the Colt .45 that had gathered dust for years. His fingers trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of old ghosts. The two men circled each other, the canyon holding its breath. Then, with a sudden burst of energy, Briggs lunged. Caleb sidestepped, the old gunslinger reflexes snapping back like muscle memory. He fired once, then again. The second bullet struck Briggs square in the chest. Briggs stumbled, eyes wide in shock, the revolver slipping from his hands. Caleb collapsed to one knee, clutching his bleeding side. Ayanna ran to him, her face pale but determined. "You're hurt, bad," she said, pressing a hand to the wound. Caleb winced, his voice strained. "I've had worse. Briggs, he's finished." Ayanna glanced at Briggs's lifeless body sprawled on the canyon floor. Her eyes burned with both triumph and sorrow. The canyon fell eerily silent after Briggs' body hit the dust, but it was only a brief pause. Two of his men remained, their shouts bouncing off the rock walls as they closed in, determined to finish what Briggs had started. Caleb struggled to his feet, the pain in his side stabbing with every breath. He tightened his grip on the Colt .45, ready to make his last stand. Beside him, Ayanna raised the captured sniper rifle, her hand steady despite the fear in her eyes. "Stay behind me," Caleb said through clenched teeth. Ayanna shook her head. "No, we fight together." The mercenaries advanced, their boots crunching on loose stone, guns drawn. Caleb took aim, but his vision blurred. He swayed, almost dropping the revolver. The men saw his weakness and grinned like predators. A sudden sound split the air, a war cry, sharp and powerful, echoing through the canyon. From the ridges above, figures emerged like shadows reborn from stone. Apache warriors, their faces painted in fierce patterns, bows drawn and arrows ready. The mercenaries froze, their bravado draining in an instant. The first arrow struck, knocking a rifle from one man's hand. Another arrow followed, burying itself into the ground just inches from his boot. The two mercenaries turned to run, but it was too late. Apache riders swept into the canyon, surrounding them with a wall of steel and spirit. One of the warriors dismounted, stepping forward with commanding presence. His hair was long and streaked with silver, his eyes deep pools of wisdom and fire. Ayana's face softened when she saw him. "Uncle," she breathed, her voice filled with both relief and reverence. The elder placed a hand on her shoulder, then looked to Caleb. His gaze lingered, sharp and assessing, as if weighing Caleb's soul. "This man fought for you?" the elder asked in a low voice. Ayana nodded. "He saved me. He fought Briggs and won." The elder studied Caleb for another long moment, then gave a single nod. "Then we will not spill more blood today." He turned to the remaining mercenaries. "Leave, now, and never return." The men didn't need to be told twice. They scrambled onto their horses and fled, tails between their legs, vanishing into the desert. Caleb staggered, his strength failing. Ayana caught him under the arm as he collapsed to his knees. "Easy," she murmured, her voice soft now. "It's over." The elder looked down at Caleb, his expression unreadable. "No," he said gently. "For him, it is just beginning." Caleb's world blurred into shadows and firelight. He felt himself being lifted, voices speaking in a language he didn't fully understand. The last thing he saw before darkness took him was Ayana's face, her hand gripping his, fierce and steady. When he opened his eyes again, it was to the scent of sage and the soft glow of a fire. He lay on a woven mat inside a large wickiup, its walls made of willow and hides. His side burned where the bullet had been removed, but the pain was muted, dulled by herbal poultices wrapped in clean linen. Ayana sat beside him, her hair braided and a soft smile playing on her lips. "You're awake," she said quietly. "I wasn't sure you'd make it through the night." Caleb tried to sit, but she placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. "Easy. The medicine woman says you'll live, but only if you rest." He looked around, noticing the tribe's people moving quietly outside the tent, their voices blending with the wind. Children laughed somewhere beyond the firelight, and the sound struck him like a memory he didn't deserve. "I don't belong here," Caleb muttered, his voice rough. "Not after what I did, to your people, to your father." Ayana's expression softened, but there was steel in her tone. "You can't undo the past, Caleb, but you didn't run this time. You fought for something bigger than yourself." She tilted her head slightly. "My uncle says that matters." The flap of the tent shifted, and the elder stepped inside. His presence filled the small space, commanding yet calm. He regarded Caleb with a measured gaze. "The spirit spared you for a reason," the elder said. "A man cannot choose the blood that stains his hands, but he can choose what he protects." Caleb lowered his eyes. "I don't deserve this kindness." The elder shook his head. "Kindness is not earned, it is given." Those words struck deeper than any bullet. Caleb felt a weight lift from his chest, not gone, but lighter, as if the ghosts had finally stepped back. Later, as the desert night sang with coyotes and wind, Ayana placed the turquoise pendant in Caleb's hand. "This belonged to my father," she said. "He would have wanted you to carry it, not as forgiveness, but as a reminder to keep fighting for what's right." Caleb's fingers closed around the stone. For the first time in 20 years, he felt something that almost resembled peace. The days after the battle passed in a blur of firelight and dreams. Caleb drifted in and out of consciousness, haunted by flashes of the canyon fight. Briggs' sneer, the smell of gunpowder, the sharp sting of pain in his side. Each time he awoke, there was always a soft voice nearby, or the quiet murmur of Apache prayers whispered like a lullaby against the wind. When he finally woke fully, the world felt different. The sun filtered through the hides of the wickiup, warm and golden, painting patterns on the ground. Ayana was sitting nearby, weaving thin strands of yucca fiber into a cord. She looked up and smiled, and for the first time since he'd met her, there was no guarded edge in her eyes. "You've slept for 2 days," she said. "The medicine woman says you're stubborn. That's why you're still alive." Caleb chuckled softly, though it sent a ripple of pain through his ribs. "Stubborn, maybe. Lucky, more likely." He paused, his eyes tracing the gentle curve of her turquoise pendant. "How many made it through?" "All of us," Ayana replied, her tone steady. "Your stand gave us time. Without you, I might not be here." She hesitated, then added, "My uncle asked me to tell you that our people will remember your courage." Caleb spent the next week learning to walk again, his side bound tight with fresh bandages. Each step hurt, but there was something liberating in the ache, like his body was slowly shedding years of rust. By the 4th morning, he found himself outside, leaning on a carved walking stick, as the children gathered around him, wide-eyed and curious. "They've never seen a white man who isn't shouting orders," Ayana teased, watching him from a distance. "Well," Caleb said with a tired grin, "I'm not much for orders these days." He knelt beside the children, showing them how to braid a rope strong enough to hold a horse. The language barrier meant little. His hands did the teaching, and their laughter did the rest. Over time, the camp became less foreign to him. He learned the rhythm of Apache songs sung at dusk, their voices blending with the rustle of the desert wind. He shared what he knew: how to mend a saddle, how to read the sky for storms, how to calm a skittish horse with nothing but a whisper and a steady hand. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Ayana found him sitting by the corral humming a tune he hadn't remembered in years. "That song," she said softly, "what is it?" Caleb's gaze was far away. "It was my daughter's favorite. I used to sing it when she was little. Haven't thought of it in 20 years. Ayana sat beside him, the silence between them comfortable now. "You should sing it again, for the children. They'd like it." Caleb smiled, a real smile, gentle, unburdened. It startled him how natural it felt. That night, under a sky jeweled with stars, he sang. His voice was low and rough, but the children listened as if he'd called the desert spirits to dance among the campfires. Ayana watched from the edge of the crowd, her eyes soft with something like understanding. For the first time in decades, Caleb felt a warmth he couldn't name. It wasn't just survival anymore. It was belonging. The dawn stretched across the desert like a painter's brush dipped in gold and fire. Caleb stood just beyond the Apache camp, his boots planted firmly in the cool sand, watching the first light spill over the distant mesas. His side still ached from the wound, but he'd stopped thinking of it as a scar. It was something else now, proof that he'd fought for more than just his own survival. Behind him, the camp stirred. Children's laughter mixed with the soft thrum of drums and the crackle of a cooking fire. Ayana approached quietly, her turquoise pendant glinting in the sunlight. She carried a small leather pouch, worn but clean, and offered it to him. "This is for you," she said. Caleb hesitated, then took the pouch. Inside was the turquoise necklace he had once seen as a symbol of everything he'd lost. Now it felt like a bridge between what he'd been and what he could become. "You saved me," Ayana said, her voice steady. "But more than that, you saved what is left of yourself. I can see it in your eyes. The ghosts aren't chasing you anymore." Caleb swallowed hard, unsure how to answer. He looked at her, seeing not just the girl he'd rescued, but a woman who had saved him in ways he hadn't expected. "I didn't do it alone," he finally said. "You showed me there's still something worth standing for." As the days passed, Caleb began to think less about the man he used to be and more about the man he might become. He spent mornings teaching the young ones to ride and afternoons learning the Apache songs and prayers from the elders. There was peace in the rhythm of it, simple, honest, and free from the burden of his past. One evening, as the sun bled into the horizon, Ayanna asked him, "Will you stay?" Caleb looked toward the mountains, where the canyon lay quiet and untouched. "Maybe for a while," he said. "There's work to do here, fences to mend, stories to keep alive. I reckon I can help with that." Ayanna smiled. "Then you'll never be alone again." On his final morning of recovery, Caleb walked to a small rise above the camp. He held the turquoise necklace in his calloused hand, whispering a prayer of gratitude, not for forgiveness, but for the chance to live again. As the first rays of sunlight touched his face, he felt something shift inside, a quiet but unshakable peace. If this story of redemption, courage, and hope moved you, you'll love the True Wild West Story series, a collection of unforgettable tales where history, grit, and human spirit collide. Watch the next story now, where another unlikely hero faces the harsh frontier and finds meaning in the unlikeliest of places. Click the video on your screen and join us on this journey into the real heart of the Wild West.